What if you could take a step back and look at the world? Explore the line between certainty and doubt. You are listening to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen-Stallone. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Illumination Hour. It's me, your host Ellen. Today I want to discuss the power of narrative and how stories shape our lives and our world. What is in a story? What does it do for us exactly? Stories are a way of creating a landscape, of setting up not just a narrative, but also an alternate reality, a sort of world that draws us into it. Maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just something that we've created. But it feels so real often when stories are told effectively. They can influence not only our emotions, but the way that we see situations and how we choose to handle them. Because often they serve as a lesson or a way of sharing experiences that keeps people interested and engaged. Sometimes I stop and wonder if there are actually any new stories, because a lot of narratives that have been told over the years are really just replications of old ones. But it's not as simple as that. Although most stories are based off of older original works, they take on a new life of their own, because every time these stories are told or retold, they are changed slightly. There's modifications made to them that make them evolve and turn them into something new and different. The interesting thing about this is that it happens because people's thoughts are never really the same. No two people think about things the same way, and even the same person thinking about the same thing can imagine it in different ways every time they think of it. So, in a way, human thoughts are kind of like wisps of smoke. They're always changing shape and never really conforming to one solid thing. Now, we know this is true because there are so many versions of every existing story, and it's thoughts like this that have brought about anti-plagiarism software that schools often use to check papers that are written by students. The idea is that no two people will ever write the same thing the same way. And I'm not saying that I think plagiarism is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, yes, I think credit should go where credit is due, but sometimes things are best said in one specific way by one specific person that just knows how to put the words or the story together in a good way. Narratives can communicate with us on many different levels in multiple different ways. Everything from the choice of words that we use when we're telling the story to inflections and silence that draws out the meaning of something that we've said, to what the characters in the story are doing, what actions they take, the human moments that we can relate with them on, the emotions and the experiences that are carried in the stories. Everything that happens, everything that goes on, any sort of communication that is being relayed to us, that all carries weight when we're talking about narratives and stories. And for as many different themes and stories that are out there, no two of them are exactly the same. And this, we can say, is because all stories share something in common, and that common theme is change. That's where the psychological power of narrative comes from. We can change our stories, thereby changing ourselves. We can change the situations that we're in or the things that we appreciate around us. The way that stories accomplish this is by allowing our imaginations to come to life and to be the powerful driving force behind what is happening in the story that we're telling. We can create a new world or a new universe where everything that exists within it is under our control. So we can explore our fears, our desires, our experiences, or things that we've always wondered about. We can come up with answers and experiment and try to find new ways of looking at situations or accentuate different aspects of our character that we want to bring to the fore, we want to bring attention to. In most stories, these different aspects of our character are represented by different characters. It's a way that we can safely explore all of the possibilities that lie within ourselves, where different traits will lead us, how different actions will affect us and the people around us, or what is really important to our lives. We can find answers to questions. We can find new things to be excited about. We can even do things that we never dreamed would have been a reality. So what got me thinking about this topic was recently I went to see a play. I was looking for things to do the other day, and I found online that there was a play happening at a local theater near where I live, and I was really hopeful going into it. I really wanted to see a good performance, and I did. When I went to the theater, it was just two men playing out Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is itself a great story, but it was also very well engineered, and the actors were passionate. You could tell that they really knew what they were doing when they were acting out each of the different characters. So on top of the story being a timeless one, the actors brought it to life. They made it more than just a story about some Frankenstein monster and the man who created that. It was suddenly like I was being dropped into this alternate universe where I was actually witnessing life events. And that's something that only really good acting and storytelling can do. And this reminded me a lot of when I was in high school, and I did a lot of theater and plays there. Growing up, I was a really shy and quiet child, and I didn't have many friends. But getting into theater allowed me to explore different aspects of myself because I could play different characters, and all of the things that I said or did, everything was okay because it was under the guise of me being this character. So in a way, acting and storytelling really helped me to develop into a better person. And I'll always appreciate acting and playwriting as an art form because I'm sure this experience isn't just limited to me. I'm sure there's many people who have found new parts of themselves through this acting, and the stories that people have written that have been turned into plays have acted as a guide for people. You know, they take on the role of one character, whether they're good or bad. You know, in this story, Frankenstein, there's the Dr. Frankenstein, and then there's his creation, his evil creation, and there's also his best friend who is his assistant. And then there's unseen characters, like the woman that Dr. Frankenstein's in love with, or his father. Then there's characters that push the plot along, like the people that the innocent Frankenstein monster accidentally kills. And you get to see the development of the character's personality and the reason why they are the way they are in a very summarized way. So it's clear to you why a character carrying out a certain action leads to them becoming a different person. And after witnessing that or experiencing it with the actors, it helps you to reflect on the changes in your own life. How things that you've gone through have also affected the way that you've become the person that you are. Also, I think a good lesson that we can get from stories like this is that it's not the characters that are totally good or evil. In fact, most characters have a little bit of both in them, but it's their actions that really define who they become in the story, and the actions that they take that explain why things happen the way they do, or how the characters develop into what they are at the end. Although in real life there's never really any end until you die, it's a constant stream of development. But seeing the stories played out in an abbreviated way shows you how your actions can define you as a person, and how you can change those actions to make better decisions to eventually lead you to become a different person. So we know that narratives are an essential part of our life. They're practically ingrained in our humanity. And to help stress this point, I have an article from beautifultrouble.org titled Narrative Power Analysis. Human beings are literally hardwired for narrative. Stories are the threads of our lives and weave together to form the fabric of human cultures. A story can inform or deceive, enlighten or entertain, or all of the above at once. We live in a world shaped by stories. A traditional power analysis gives organizers and activists an understanding of the power relations and institutional dynamics among key target decision makers and allies. Narrative power analysis provides a framework to extend power analysis into narrative space, the intangible realm of stories, ideas, and assumptions that frame the public perception of the situation and the players in question. Narrative helps define what is normal and what is legitimate, as well as the limits of what is possible. All power relations have such a narrative component. Narrative power analysis is based on the recognition that the currency of story is not truth, but meaning. That is, what makes a story powerful is not necessarily facts, but how the story creates meaning in the hearts and minds of the listeners. Therefore, the obstacle to convincing people is often not what they don't yet know, but actually what they already do know. In other words, people's existing assumptions and beliefs can act as narrative filters to prevent them from hearing social change messages. A narrative power analysis seeks to unearth the hidden building blocks of these pernicious narratives so that a narrative of liberation can better change them. So the rest of the article goes on to talk about how narratives can help shape people's opinions when we're talking about political or social change. And although that is a way that stories and narratives are used, in fact, politicians use them all the time. Many of the stories that we currently have about our culture are based on narratives that were told at some point that may carry some truth in them, but often they're embellished in some way or they leave important facts out. So while it's true that narratives can be used to shape a society and a culture in a very big way, I don't want to spend a lot of time focusing so much on the political uses of narrative, because there are many. Narratives are used in areas such as education. supposedly before public schools, many people were uneducated, and that's why we had to form a system where children were forced to go to school every day. When in fact, oftentimes the children don't want to be there or aren't learning things that they actually find valuable. So narratives can shape a society, but I don't want to talk about the political portion of narratives. Perhaps I will in some future show, but to be honest, I find it kind of depressing that stories can be used to change people's mind or to convince them of things, which in the end just contribute to their enslavement. I want to focus on just the beginning of what this article said. That stories are the threads of our lives, and together they form the fabric of human cultures when they're woven together. Also, they don't always have to be truthful. They just have to be meaningful in order for people to appreciate them or to understand them. And in fact, stories are incredibly powerful. Stories have been shaping our lives since the beginning of human existence. Today, they're an intrinsic part of our society. They're something that we find everywhere. In music, in books, movies, news media, religions, architecture, and painting. Storytelling affects every part of our lives. Everything has a story. Even the simplest of objects, such as a pencil. It has 100 stories behind its own creation and invention. We often use stories to define our values or express our desires or explain dreams, as well as negative feelings such as hatred or fear or prejudice. But stories have a very deep root in our identity as humans. Traditionally, oral stories have been passed on from generation to generation, and we have no way to know exactly where storytelling started. Did it happen in some dark, gloomy, damp cave as ancient people were sitting around a campfire sharing food and stories of the hunt, or some terrifying predator that they came in contact with, or maybe a neighboring tribe? We may never know where the first story was told or what it was about. But it is believed that the origin of storytelling was a sort of comfort or an explanation for things that people didn't understand. Maybe they were used to calm the fears or doubts of a family if they were facing a long, cold, hard winter. As families grouped with other families and formed clans, the storyteller, who was great at telling heroic stories of events, began to reach a position of respect and power within the group. Of course, people found their stories interesting, and they would listen and then share those stories with other people. So some people who might have used stories in this manner were people like the ruler, the judge, or the priest. They learned to use this art effectively as a way to secure their position and to convince people that they were right. Before anybody had written language, people had to rely on their memories to remember things. In order for people to remember stories and tell them, they had to be good listeners. And people who listen well and share stories well are usually always respected. They can find an audience that are eager to devour every exciting bit of information that they have to share. These stories were often also shared with other people in faraway lands. As people traveled, their stories traveled with them. And when they returned home, they would bring with them new, exciting tales from exotic places and people. If we look at the history of storytelling, we can see that they came in all different varieties. Myths, legends, fairy tales, trickster stories, fables, ghost tales, hero stories, and epic adventures. passing down from generation to generation, these stories reflected the wisdom and the knowledge and experiences of early people. Sometimes they were used to explain important but often confusing events, and sometimes natural disasters in early times. For example, fire, storms, thunder and lightning, floods, tidal waves, solar eclipses. Because people had no better way of understanding these events besides the stories they heard, it was common for people to believe in stories of gods or mythical beings who had control over these things. Most importantly of all, though, people who shared these stories were bound together through this common belief or heritage. One of the oldest stories in existence is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the story of creation. Creation myths were probably the most influential among people because it's been an enduring question through our history. Where do we come from? How did all of this come to be? Why is it that we are alive and not inanimate like the rocks or the rivers that surround us? There have also been many famous storytellers throughout history, some of them being more well-known than others. Since the invention of printing, stories have been passed on not only orally but through works of literature. These stories that have been printed are able not only to last through time, but also through space. They can be sent from one end of the world to the other. And so because of printing, many of these historical authors and storytellers have lived on through the years and are still fondly remembered today. The fairy tales, legends, and fables that we know now have often come from far, far in the past. The author Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, calls stories love gifts. And sometimes that's true. I want to share with you one instance of when it may not have been a love gift. This is about the origin of Arabian Nights. According to legend, a queen named Scheherazade told these stories to Sultan Sharia to save her life. Each night she told him tales, stopping at the most exciting part so that he would have to wait until the next night to learn what had happened. Of course, each night that she was able to do this, she avoided being beheaded. After 1001 nights, the Sultan granted Scheherazade her life. They got married, and her stories were recorded for all of the world to read. They include stories such as Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Sinbad the Sailor, and Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. Some of my favorite stories from childhood are those of Aesop's fables. Aesop was a storyteller who lived in ancient Greece. He usually uses animals as the characters in his fables, which show how a problem is solved and a moral or lesson is learned. Aesop's stories include The Boy Who Cried Wolf and The Tortoise and the Hare. They were first written around 300 BC. Although Aesop has many other wonderful fables, and they're all relatively short, but they each contain an important little bit of wisdom. Perhaps one of my favorite is The Crow and the Pitcher. A crow, half dead with thirst, came upon a pitcher which had once been full of water. But when the crow put its little beak into the mouth of the pitcher, he found that only very little water was left. Try as he could not reach far down enough to get it. He tried and tried, but at last had to give up in despair. Then a thought came to him, and he took a pebble and dropped it into the pitcher. Then he took another pebble, and another, and another. At last, he saw the water mount up near him, and after casting in a few more pebbles, he was able to quench his thirst and save his life. Now, the moral at the end of this says, little by little does the trick. And maybe the point is persistence. But a story like this, from what I take away from it, is that there's a solution to every problem. And all it takes is a little creativity. And that's another beautiful thing that I admire about stories, is that you can take out just about any meaning. You can find things in the story that are important to you, and not necessarily to anyone else or to the author, but you can find your own meaning within these narratives. Another group of stories that I enjoyed when I was younger, and now I find fascinating for a different reason, are Grimm's fairy tales. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were brothers who lived in Germany. After their parents died, the brothers traveled around the country and gathered stories. When they published these tales in the early 19th century, they became famous. Their collections include Hansel and Gretel and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But they also created many new renditions of older stories, such as Rapunzel, although their stories usually have a darker, more morbid side to them. For example, in the Grimm fairy tale version of Rapunzel, the witch finds out that Rapunzel is seeing a prince because Rapunzel naively asks why her dress is getting tight around her stomach, indicating that she's pregnant. Another fairy tale that they recreated was that of Cinderella, and there are a few key differences in the Grimm version of the story from the traditional Disney-type version. But the main one is that when the prince shows up to Cinderella's house and he's asking her sisters to try on the shoe, they cut off their toes to make their feet fit in the shoes. Now, this is very different from, say, Perrault's version of fairy tales, which is more of the familiar Disney variety. Charles Perrault lived in France in the 17th century. He retired from government service and began to take popular folk tales and change them into children's fairy tales with morals. He was very successful because he was one of the first French writers to write especially for children. His most famous fairy tales are Sleeping Beauty, Tom Thumb, and Puss in Boots. It's interesting to me that these authors have survived throughout the ages and have not fallen into obscurity like so many others. Perhaps the reason that people still remember them today is because of the wisdom and meaning that's in their stories, but there's also an entertainment value. When you're listening to a good story, you kind of just get sucked in and begin to let your imagination wander. Your world for a minute gets put on pause, and you start exploring this different world that somebody else has created. Also, I want to talk about a few more of the differences between Perrault and Grimm's fairy tales. They're based on the same stories. Cinderella, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood. Stories like that we all remember from, or at least I remember from childhood, because they were turned into children's movies or children's books. And these stories are hundreds, if not thousands of years old. They've continued to evolve throughout the years and change, and different versions can mean completely different things, or perhaps they accomplish the same thing in the end, but in very different ways. There can be all sorts of hidden morals and values within each of these stories, and some of them are more honest than others. When we hear Perrault's version of Cinderella, it's almost too good to be true. The story is much more of a fictional nature. There's a fairy godmother that just grants whatever wish Cinderella wants, and she ever so kindly puts up with the abuse that she's living with. The same is true in Grimm's version, but at least in the Grimm version, there is an explanation for why she's doing this. Although it does involve a bit of morbidity in the story, because as Cinderella was a child, she watched her mother die, and on her deathbed she told her to always be kind and patient and understanding. Now, death is not a theme that many storytellers want to face children with because they feel like they can't handle it. But I think that's demeaning to children. I think children can handle it, and in fact, it's a part of their world. It is a real aspect of life that they must face at some point or another. In Perrault's version, there is no death. There's no cruelty. There's no chopping off of toes. There's just a poor girl who wishes for things and gets them. The lesson that I think children will take away from that is that if they just wish for things hard enough or long enough, eventually they'll come to them. And that somehow they will be touched by the hand of some spirit that will grant them the patience and kindness to get through life. When in fact, that's not true. There has to be some cause for it. It doesn't just come to you. And that's why I give credit to Grimm's fairy tales more than to Perrault's, because the Grimm fairy tale versions of stories at least deals with real things that sometimes we go through, even if it's in a fictional way. It deals with difficult topics. And of course, it's not geared towards children. It's more of an adult level book. But I feel like you can relate to those stories better just because they do grapple with concepts such as death and desperation and people acting out of cowardice or courage, or perhaps promises they made to themselves, or dealing with memories that they have that might be unpleasant. It's just more real, more relatable. Another author that I want to discuss a little bit that is incredibly well known worldwide and has been dead for several hundred years but is still greatly appreciated today is Shakespeare. Of course, I couldn't do a show and talk about stories without covering Shakespeare. Many people adore him, unquestioningly. And I also adore Shakespeare, not unquestioningly, but I understand why he's so well known even today. His plays are works of genius, really. They have so many levels of communication with the audience. There's metaphors, there's meaning in every action, every step, every word. Even the words that he chooses are so beautiful. It's his writing style that is really outstanding. It's like long-form poetry, but with the most beautiful imagery and word choice. Though often Shakespeare's plays also contain a great amount of violence and death, but there's still meaning that we can draw from them. Often his stories contain incredible insight into the human condition, how people behave under different circumstances, how people change. Although some of his stories, I believe, are not as great as many people acclaim them to be. For example, Romeo and Juliet, a love story about two teenagers who meet each other and fall in love and want to get married the next day. It's unreal. Does anybody fall in love that quickly? In the end, Juliet tries to get away from her family by taking a sleeping potion. Then Romeo finds her without knowing that she's only asleep. He thinks that she's dead, so of course he goes to buy poison and kills himself. Then Juliet, when she wakes up, finds Romeo dead there and kills herself as well. I say it's a little bit more than a stretch to think that two people could fall madly in love so quickly and then kill themselves over each other only a few days after that. Of course, I think in the end, the real message that he was trying to get across in this story was that the children had killed themselves over each other, and the Capulets and Montagues, who had been carrying on this generational war, finally decided to settle their differences because of the death of these children. Which I think that's a worthy message, although the story of Romeo and Juliet being as it is not an incredibly powerful romance. If anything, it's just two delusional teenagers who perhaps have a crush on each other or feel that they're in love with each other, but I don't think it's possible for a great romance to be carried out over just a couple days. If anything, perhaps it was their passion that's so influential to people. But there is certainly more to love than just seeing somebody who looks like a ray of sunlight and then feeling something in response to that. Another of Shakespeare's plays that I find a little disturbing, to say the least, is The Taming of the Shrew. In this story, there's a man with two daughters, one who's very beautiful and lovely and everyone loves her, and then an older sister who is less lovely and also much meaner and less easy to get along with. Their father says that the youngest daughter can only be married off when the older daughter is, so some men come up with a scheme to get the older daughter married off so that they can have a chance at the younger daughter. In the story, a character named Petruchio marries the older daughter, thinking that he can convince her to fall in love with him, even though she is wretched and mean. So he marries her, and he embarrasses her in front of her family, dressing in an absurd outfit, and then he brings her to his house, where he mistreats her, he starves her, he continuously pokes and prods at her. He doesn't give her anything she asks for. Basically, he treats her terribly. And in the end, worn down by her husband's relentless eccentricity, she submits and accepts everything that he says. So, in effect, he has tamed the shrew. Probably the worst part of this story is the ending, where Petruchio devises a competition to prove whose wife is the most obedient. So, the younger sister, the older sister, and some of their friends are in another room, and the men start calling to their wives. They're like, "Hey, Bianca, come over here." But she pretends like she didn't hear it. That's when the older sister, the shrew who has been tamed, turns on the other woman and starts lecturing them on the duties of a wife, to be obedient to their husband. I find this story disturbing for several reasons. First, that the father was even in control of when or who they were getting married to in the first place. Secondly, that the shrew, this horrible, mean, wretched woman, was mistreated and essentially tortured and starved in order to break her in like a horse. She's just so tired of all of the mistreatment that eventually she does whatever Petruchio asks of her, only because she wants the mistreatment to stop. And then in the end, she becomes completely indoctrinated and now is perpetuating this idea that you have to do whatever your husband tells you to because it's your duty. Now, I don't know about you, but I would definitely like to be in control of my choice of spouse. And also, if I chose a spouse and they mistreated me the way Petruchio mistreated his wife, I would not only leave, I would warn other people to stay away from him. I'm glad that we live in the modern era and not in Shakespearean times, because I don't believe that there's any duty that anybody has to anyone else. There's no responsibility that you have to follow through with, nothing that you owe anyone. You don't have to behave in any way except for the way that you believe is best. It sounds a bit like Stockholm Syndrome to me at the end when the shrew is lecturing the other women on how to be good wives. Has she really convinced herself that the best thing to do is to obey orders? And the men in this story, the society is way too patriarchal for me. Though there is one Shakespeare story that I'm very familiar with that I greatly enjoy, and that is Hamlet. So I'm just going to read you a plot summary of Hamlet from nosweatshakespeare.com because it's a long, complicated story and there's a lot that goes on inside of it. To me, it's a psychological thriller story, but at the time, I don't think that genre existed. This was termed under tragedy. So Prince Hamlet's student friend, Horatio, goes to the battlements of Denmark's Ellesnore Castle late at night to meet the guards. They tell him about a ghost they have seen that resembles the late king. It reappears, and they decide to tell the prince. Hamlet's uncle, Claudius, having become king, has now married Hamlet's widowed mother, Gertrude. In the court, after envoys are sent to Norway, the prince is dissuaded from returning to university. Hamlet still mourns his father's death, and hearing of the ghost from Horatio, he is determined to see it for himself. Laertes, son of the courtier Polonius, departs for France, warning his sister Ophelia against thinking too much of Hamlet's attentions, because Ophelia and Hamlet in this story are lovers. The ghost appears to Hamlet and tells him that he was murdered by Claudius. The prince swears vengeance, and his friends are sworn to secrecy as Hamlet decides to feign madness while he tests the truth of the ghost's allegations. He rejects Ophelia, as Claudius and Polonius spy on him, seeking to find the reason for his sudden strange behavior. Guildenstern and Rosencrantz, former student friends of Hamlet's, are summoned by Claudius, and their arrival coincides with that of a group of traveling actors. The prince knows these players well, and they rehearse together before arranging to present Hamlet's choice of play before the king and queen, which will include scenes close to the circumstances of the old king's death. At the performance, Hamlet watches closely as Claudius is provoked into interrupting the play and storming out, resolving to send the prince away to England. Hamlet is summoned by his distressed mother, and on the way he spares Claudius, whom he sees kneeling, attempting to pray. To kill him while he is praying would send his soul to heaven rather than to the hell he deserves. Polonius hides in Gertrude's room to listen to the conversation, but Hamlet detects movement as he unbraids his mother. He stabs the concealed tapestry and so kills the old man. The ghost reappears, warning his son not to delay revenge, nor to upset his mother. As the army of Norway's King Fortinbras crosses Denmark to attack Poland, Hamlet is sent to England, ostensibly as an ambassador. But he discovers Claudius's plan to have him killed. Outwitting this plot, Hamlet returns alone, sending Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their deaths in his stead. During Hamlet's absence, Ophelia goes mad as a result of her father's death, and she is drowned. Hamlet returns and meets Horatio in the graveyard. With the arrival of Ophelia's funeral, Hamlet confronts Laertes, who, after attempting a revolt against Claudius, has taken his father's place at the court. A duel is arranged between Hamlet and Laertes, at which Claudius has plotted for Hamlet to die either on a poisoned rapier or from poisoned wine. The plan goes wrong, and both Laertes and Hamlet are wounded, while Gertrude unwittingly drinks from the poisoned cup. Hamlet, in his death throes, kills Claudius, and Horatio is left to explain the truth to the new king, Fortinbras, who returns victorious from the Polish Wars. This play has some really amazing scenes in it, and I would recommend it for anyone if they haven't already read it. Although, of course, this is a tragedy, but it's also a story of cunning, of wits, of careful decisions, and of people cracking under the pressure of their bad decisions, of the guilt that they live with. There are so many layers in this story, in fact, that I think it will never cease to be entertaining. I mean, perhaps there are stories similar to this, but nobody could write stories the way Shakespeare did. Because he is so well known and so well quoted, people have taken stories such as this and they've turned it into something new or different. And although the original may be great in many ways, people today still enjoy bringing these stories to life, not only through acting or reading them, but through rewriting them, through evolving them and changing them. In fact, it's hard even to stick to the same story anytime a play such as Shakespeare's is acted out, because in many ways the actors determine the story. Whether it's by changing expressions or movements, or placing emphasis on different things. There are many Shakespearean actors who I think get a real thrill out of this. There are many debates about how lines should be said or what lines should be included. And I think actors who take on the responsibility of portraying these stories realize how people enacting events in front of an audience tugs at their emotions. It's not just that they're hearing the story being told, it's that they're seeing people that they can relate to act out these events. It's as if they're seeing directly into the lives of the characters. They're getting a window into their mind, into their most personal moments. And through that, they can connect and form an even greater narrative between the actors and the audience. I don't think that theater is going to die anytime soon, although some people would say that the art of acting is going away, but I certainly don't think so. In fact, there's probably more of it now than there was in the past. And maybe it's not happening in plays being acted out on a stage, but certainly a lot of it is being done on television and in movies. Movies and television are basically the modern, convenient extension of acting in front of an audience. It's convenient because you can just film yourself acting something, put it on a little disc, and send it to anyone, anywhere. Also, with movies, I think there's a greater ability to express creativity because not only can you control what the actors are doing and saying, but you can also control the camera, the music, the lighting, the effects. Most people don't take full advantage of the creative possibilities that are inherent within creating a movie. Because there are so many things that can be controlled, there's so much room for artistry in that. Of course, it's really easy to just make a movie with a lot of gunshots and explosions or people dying or dramatic scenes. There are plenty of movies that are hardly memorable. But again, as in all storytelling, there are some movies that are enduring and unforgettable. They're timeless. To me, one of the greatest directors that I will never forget and will always appreciate is Alfred Hitchcock. And that's because he paid such close attention to those details. Not only what the actors were saying, but also how they said it, where they stood when they were talking, their body language, their clothing. Now, often Alfred Hitchcock themed his movies around murder mysteries or something violent like that. But his brilliance lied in the simple fact that he would make the audience suffer as much as possible. He was great at building tension and setting scenes and making characters believable. And often there was foreshadowing in the film that you wouldn't catch unless you had seen the film already. Most people agreed that his best film was Vertigo. It may have been his biggest masterpiece. It's a subtle yet meticulously crafted film that weaves complex storylines into a thrilling experience for the viewer. The most skillful part of this film was perhaps the blocking. There's one particular scene in Vertigo where an ex-detective and a man who wants to have his wife followed are talking to each other in the man's house. The way the scene plays out is that the ex-detective is at first not sure about following the man's wife, and the man slowly convinces the detective that his wife has gone crazy. And while he's doing this, a sort of dance is played out between the two men. At first, the man lures the detective in by being understanding of his confusion and taking a submissive position. Then once the detective decides to leave, but then turns around because he can't leave such a mystery unsolved, the detective sits down in a chair as an audience member while the man talking about his wife's strange behavior walks around as an actor on a stage, even though the scene is being played out in his house. The thing that the detective and the audience don't really know at this point in the story is that the man is planning to have his wife killed. So the dance that these two men perform during this conversation is like a psychological game of cat and mouse. It's a serious game of power exchange and manipulation. But the brilliance in the scene is not only that Hitchcock is manipulating the detective character, but he's also manipulating the audience into believing the man. This is a great example in how controlling a scene and all of the meticulous little details in it can control the audience's reaction. All throughout this show, I've been talking about narratives, stories, how they're told, what they convey, the currency of narratives, which is not truth, but meaning. Though the way stories are told has changed over time, how stories are spread, now they're not oral, they're mostly visual, they still do the same thing to us that they always have. They give us entertainment, explanation, comfort, ideas. They can change our minds, our beliefs. They can make us feel so many different things. And it's always important to pay attention to not only what is being told in the story, but why is it being told? If we can learn to analyze narratives in not just a surface level way, but also taking a step farther back and trying to understand why the story is being told in the first place. What's the purpose that the author is trying to Perhaps we can learn more about our history, The narratives that have been told to us our entire lives. Why are they being perpetuated? What purpose do they serve to us? Are they beneficial? Is the meaning true? Learn to understand the stories that shape your world, and you can begin to reshape it and form your own new narratives. Because each one of us are not only characters in somebody else's play, we're also the authors of our own scenarios. We write our lives, we make the decisions, we play God in our world. So always keep that in mind. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this show. Thanks for listening, everyone. You can email me your thoughts, comments, and questions at illuminationhour@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.